Brace yourselves, Africa, because the ground is shaking in Tanzania. And no, it's not an earthquake. It's the roar of a lion in uniform. On the morning of October 4th, a Tanzanian soldier named Captain John Charles Tesher looked straight into a camera and did what few men in uniform ever dare. He spoke the truth not to please but to provoke. His words have set Dar es Salaam trembling and the ruling party scrambling behind their palace walls. In that one-hour video, Captain Tesher tore the veil off what millions of Tanzanians whisper about, but fear to say aloud: corruption, election fraud, and a deep state draining the nation's soul. He didn't read from a script. He read from pain. "I'm not afraid of anyone," he declared, voice steady, but eyes burning. It wasn't just defiance, it was confession, warning, and prayer rolled into one. Across Africa, people are watching and asking, is this another coup in the making or the beginning of a cleansing fire? From Ouagadougou to Nairobi, citizens remember another Captain, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who stood up against a corrupt system and rewrote his nation's destiny. Could Tanzania now be walking the same road? Because what began as one soldier's plea has turned into a national roar. Young Tanzanians are flooding TikTok, WhatsApp, and X with the hashtag #NanerCaptainTesher, turning his defiance into a movement. The establishment calls it rebellion. The people call it hope. And so before you decide which side you're on, ask yourself this: what happens when the last honest soldier stops obeying orders? Can one man's truth ignite a nation's conscience? Stay with me, because this story isn't just about Tanzania's future, it's about Africa's awakening. Please share if you believe that integrity still matters in public office. Subscribe if you believe that the truth, not fear, should rule this continent. It began not with a protest, not with gunfire, but with silence, the kind of silence that comes before something sacred or dangerous. On October 4th, Captain John Charles Tesher, a weapons instructor in the Tanzania People's Defense Force (TPDF), placed a camera in front of him, whispered a prayer, and pressed record. What followed would send shockwaves through the country's most guarded institutions. "I thank Almighty God for giving me the courage to speak," he began softly, the words trembling. Not from fear, but conviction. "I am not afraid of anyone." He wasn't reading from a script. There were no teleprompters, no flags waving behind him, only the raw voice of a man who had seen too much and could no longer stay silent. In that video, Tesher did what no active duty officer in Tanzania had dared to do in decades. He accused his own government of treason against the people. One by one, he named the powerful former President Jakaya Kikwete tycoon Rostam Aziz, and even President Samia Suluhu Hassan's own son Abdul, as part of a corrupt network that had hijacked the nation. He called them a deep state, a government within a government, a cabal that made decisions without the consent of the people or even the leaders elected by law. His message was clear, brutal, and unfiltered. Tanzania, he said, had been sold piece by piece, its gold mines, its coal fields, its ports, and even its people's dignity to the highest bidder. While the rich grew fat on foreign contracts, children in Tonga scavenged for food, and mothers in Morogoro gave birth in hospitals without electricity. But Tesher didn't stop at accusation. He made a call, one that no one expected. He urged the military to take over the country very quickly. Very quickly. Very quickly. 3 times he repeated it, as if to hammer the urgency into every soldier's conscience. He said the army was the last pillar of hope, the only institution still trusted by ordinary Tanzanians, and he feared that if that pillar fell, the nation will crumble. Inside the barracks, whispers turned to clenched fists. In the streets, the poor listened through shaky phone screens, nodding in quiet agreement. This was not the rant of a madman. It was the reflection of millions. Tesher spoke for every soldier forced to salute a thief, for every farmer taxed twice and fed half, for every student whose dreams had been mortgaged by the elite. And then came the most explosive claim of all, the death of former President John Pombe Magufuli in 2021. Tesher called it no natural tragedy, but a hit orchestrated by the same inner circle of power he had just named. He said insiders like Humphrey Polpol had leaked evidence of hit squads operating from Dodoma to Dubai. For many, it was unthinkable. For others, it simply confirmed what they had always suspected. By the end of the broadcast, Captain Tesher had become a marked man. Yet, for a brief electric moment, Tanzania felt alive, as if someone had cracked open the nation's sealed conscience. The video spread like wildfire, 5.7 million views in less than 48 hours shared on TikTok, WhatsApp, and YouTube, tagged with one phrase, "Hats Captain Tesher." He ended his speech not with threats, but with faith. The army must act, he said, not to rule, but to restore order, to protect the Constitution, and to return power to the people. His face was tired, his uniform creased, his eyes wet, but behind him, millions found something they thought they had lost: courage. In that single video, a soldier without armor became the spark that could ignite a continent. The silence didn't last. Within 24 hours, Tanzania's calm exterior began to crack. The TPDF headquarters in Dar es Salaam issued a brief, chilling statement. "We follow the Constitution, not individuals." It was meant to silence the storm, but it did the opposite. The statement landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples turned into waves. Across the country, from the crowded streets of Arusha to the dusty barracks of Dodoma, soldiers whispered the same question. Was Captain Tesher wrong, or was he the only one brave enough to speak? Inside those barracks, the mood shifted. Officers scrolled through Tesher's video on their phones in secret, lowering the volume, afraid of being seen, yet unable to look away. He had said what they'd all been thinking: "We are tired of saluting thieves." The public reaction came faster than the government expected. Yes, Captain Tesher exploded across TikTok, X, and WhatsApp, climbing to the top of trending lists, not just in Tanzania, but in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia. Students remixed his speech into songs. Market women in Kariakoo whispered his name between stalls of cassava and maize. The people had found their echo. But the government saw danger. Internet speeds dropped mysteriously in Dar es Salaam. Independent bloggers vanished. A few were invited for questioning, yet the damage was done. Tesher's words were already alive in a million hearts. The climax came when his most explosive claim that former President John Pombe Magufuli's death in 2021 had been a political assassination hit the airwaves. For many Tanzanians, Magufuli had been the last leader who dared to challenge corruption. His death had always carried shadows of suspicion, but Tesher's statement gave that suspicion a name and a face. Suddenly, every conversation turned dangerous. The ruling party, CCM, went into defensive overdrive, denying everything, while their supporters called Tesher a traitor. But something had already shifted. Fear was no longer one-sided. For the first time, it was the ruling class that seemed afraid. Internationally, news outlets hesitated. Western media tiptoed around the story, calling Tesher a controversial figure. African outlets, however, erupted. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso, commentators called him Tanzania's Traore. His defiance was being compared to the young captain from Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré, who in 2022 defied France, expelled foreign troops, and nationalized gold mines to rebuild his country's dignity. Memes began circulating, showing both men side by side, Tesher in green fatigues, Traoré in red beret, under the caption "One Continent, One Courage." But courage has a price. On October 5th, TPDF confirmed that Tesher had been stripped of his rank and declared a deserter. Rumors swirled that he had gone into hiding, protected by fellow officers sympathetic to his cause. Some claimed he was already across the border. Others swore they'd seen him in Mbeya, moving under cover of night. And still the movement grew. Tanzania's Gen Z refused to let his voice die. They organized digital vigils, their screens glowing in the dark with the words, "We are Captain Tesher." The same youth who once chanted for football heroes now chanted for a soldier they had never met. From the rural heartlands to the diaspora abroad, Tanzanians began re-examining the unthinkable. Could the military actually step in, not to seize power, but to cleanse it? That thought alone sent shivers through the political elite. Meanwhile, other African nations watched closely. After Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger's revolutions, many believed East Africa would remain immune. Tesher's defiance proved otherwise. The torch of rebellion, once confined to the Sahel, was now burning toward the Indian Ocean. And through it all, Tesher's last words echoed like a prophecy: "If the army doesn't act soon, chaos will." At that moment, one man's voice had done what years of opposition politics could not: unite a weary people under a single dangerous idea that sometimes silence is treason. The days that followed felt like walking on cracked glass. Every conversation in Tanzania carried weight, every whisper carried risk. The government had officially labeled Captain Tesher a fugitive, a disgrace to the uniform, and yet his words had already spread too far to be buried. What began as a lone soldier's confession was now a civic storm tearing through the nation's conscience. In Dar es Salaam, ordinary citizens spoke his name in hushed tones, in cafes, in taxis, at markets. Some feared him, others revered him, but no one could ignore him. In Arusha, university students held silent vigils, holding cardboard signs with a single line from his speech, "If the army doesn't act soon, chaos will." They weren't calling for blood, they were calling for honesty. Meanwhile, President Samia Suluhu Hassan doubled down. Her campaign for re-election in 2025 shifted into overdrive: new billboards, new promises, new money. According to leaked reports, billions of shillings flowed into campaign coffers while rural clinics went dark. For many, it felt like a betrayal repeating itself. Tanzania's democracy had turned into a one-party masquerade, and Tesher's rebellion had simply exposed what everyone already knew but feared to admit. In Morogoro and Mwanza, anger took a quieter form. Farmers refused to attend ruling party rallies. Teachers stopped wearing party badges. Civil servants began muttering in corridors that the captain was right. In some villages, soldiers returning from patrols were greeted with applause as if the people were secretly saluting Tesher through them. But beneath that quiet defiance, fear grew. Opposition leaders Freeman Mbowe and Tundu Lissu remained in legal limbo, their voices muzzled. Churches and mosques that dared mention corruption found their doors padlocked. In Ngorongoro, entire Maasai families were forced off ancestral lands to make way for foreign-owned safari lodges. The country's wounds were no longer hidden, they were televised. By the second week, the tension had spread into the heart of the TPDF itself. Some senior officers privately sympathized with Tesher's concerns, even as they condemned his actions publicly. Others feared that if dissent spread through the ranks, discipline could collapse entirely. And in a military where unity is everything, the mere hint of division was enough to terrify those at the top. Economically, the markets reacted to uncertainty. The Tanzanian shilling dropped 6% in a single week. Foreign investors froze contracts. Rumors of military arrests and internal purges kept the business elite awake at night. It was as if the country had inhaled deeply and forgotten how to breathe. Across East Africa, the ripples were immediate. Commentators in Kenya and Uganda began to warn of a Sahel contagion, the spread of military-led revolts inspired by Burkina Faso and Niger. Some leaders quietly tightened security within their own armies, fearing the same infection of conscience. But others, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso, praised Tesher's courage, calling him a mirror held up to the soul of the continent. By the end of that week, Tanzania had become something it had not been in decades: unpredictable. The ruling elite could still command the police, the courts, and the press, but not the hearts of their people. That had shifted irreversibly, because when one soldier's truth breaks the silence, it doesn't end in the barracks. It begins in the homes, the schools, the churches, and the streets, until an entire nation starts asking the same forbidden question: if our leaders have betrayed us, who will protect us now? And in Tanzania, that question no longer belonged to Captain Tesher alone. It belonged to everyone. To the outside world, Tanzania's tremor looked familiar, almost predictable. But to those who had watched Africa's recent revolutions, it felt like déjà vu. Once again, a soldier had spoken where politicians stayed silent. Once again, a uniform had become a microphone for the people. In Washington, the first response was diplomatic restraint. The U.S. State Department released a cautious statement urging respect for constitutional processes, the same line it had used after coups in Burkina Faso and Niger. In the Western press, Captain Tesher was branded a radical nationalist and a threat to stability. But on African social media, the reaction was different. Tesher was trending next to Ibrahim Traoré and Assimi Goïta, hailed not as rebels, but as patriots. Across Europe, analysts warned of a dangerous contagion of populism in Africa's armies. France, still reeling from its expulsion from Mali and Burkina Faso, called the situation deeply concerning. But behind those diplomatic phrases was a quieter fear that Africa was slipping out of Western control. From the Sahel to the Indian Ocean, the new vocabulary was no longer aid, but autonomy, no longer partners, but equals. And while Western governments spoke of democracy, many Africans whispered about dignity. They remembered how the same powers that condemned coups also supported dictators as long as their minds stayed open and their ports stayed cheap. Tesher's words, echoing through smartphones across the continent, tore through that hypocrisy. He wasn't just accusing Tanzanian elites, he was indicting an entire system of global exploitation. In Burkina Faso, young soldiers reportedly replayed Tesher's speech during night drills, calling him the Eastern Brother. State media in Mali and Niger ran short commentaries praising his courage and comparing his defiance to Captain Traoré's 2022 revolution, the moment when a small West African nation told Paris, "Our gold belongs to us." Even in the United States, African Americans on online forums and Pan-African circles began discussing Tanzania in a new light. They saw Tesher's defiance as part of a larger awakening, one that stretched from Harlem to Harare, from Ferguson to Freetown. To them, this wasn't just about coups. It was about reclaiming self-respect in a world that too often dictated who Africans should be and how they should lead. But within policy circles, fear took hold. American strategists quietly noted that Africa's young officers were no longer graduates of U.S.-sponsored academies. They were thinkers in their own right, trained at home reading Sankara and Nkrumah, and yes, Ibrahim Traoré. The Pentagon called it a generational shift. Meanwhile, the African Union walked a tightrope, condemning military interference while acknowledging the legitimate frustrations of citizens. In the streets, however, those frustrations had already turned into chants. For much of the Western world, Captain Tesher's defiance is a crisis. But for Africa, it may be a mirror, a reflection of a continent no longer asking for permission, but for justice. And as the world debates whether he's a traitor or a truth-teller, one question grows louder in Washington, Paris, and London alike. If Ibrahim Traoré lit the fire in the West, has Tanzania now carried that flame to the east? Night falls over Dar es Salaam, and yet the air still trembles with what one man said in daylight. Captain John Charles Tesher has vanished from public view. Some say he's in hiding, others believe he's already been silenced. But his voice, his courage, and his defiance refuse to die. They have become part of something larger, something Africa has been building for decades, a quiet rebellion against the idea that freedom must be granted rather than claimed. Tanzania today stands at a crossroads that history has drawn before. On one side, the familiar comfort of corruption, the same faces, the same excuses, the same rituals of power disguised as democracy. On the other, the dangerous, unpredictable road of renewal, a road that begins with truth and often ends in sacrifice. The world will call it instability. But perhaps it is rebirth. Because every generation must face its test, and for Tanzania, this may be it. When a soldier risks everything to speak truth to power, it forces the nation to look in the mirror. What do we see? Do we see a republic of fear or a republic of faith? Across the continent, from the streets of Ouagadougou to the villages of Mwanza, one message echoes. Africa is tired of borrowed freedom. It wants to define its own. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have proven that sovereignty is not a slogan. It's a discipline, one that demands courage, sacrifice, and self-reliance. Now the same question moves eastward toward the Indian Ocean. Will Tanzania follow? Because this is bigger than Tesher, bigger than politics, and bigger than one country's pain. It's about the awakening of a continent that refuses to be ruled by fear. And to our viewers across the ocean, especially those in America, ask yourself this: if a soldier in Africa can risk his life for truth, what are we willing to risk for justice in our own world? The dawn may be slow, but it always comes to those who dare to wait and to fight for it. So share this story. Let others know that something real is stirring in Africa, not chaos, but conscience. Please share if you believe that truth still has a place in leadership. Subscribe if you believe that Africa deserves voices like Captain Tesher's and that the world deserves to hear them. Because as long as one man stands for truth, the fire of integrity will never die. Light it, Tanzania. Light it, Africa. The dawn is waiting.